It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to see this many progressive Democrats gathered in one room in Northern Virginia. I come from Tacoma Park, Maryland. Everybody you see is a progressive Democrat. In fact, they think of progressive Democrats as kind of right of center. Well, I woke up on November 5th last year, very discouraged, like probably a lot of you in this room. It looked pretty bleak, only a couple years after a great election in November 2008. I will say, though, it looks like the world around us is changing once again, as it does. May have started in Madison, Wisconsin, with the fight by students and workers against. It's spread to Columbus, Ohio, and Indiana, and Maine, and New Hampshire. We're fighting in a lot of places at once. And of course, just this week, the election in New York 26, which is described as a ruby red district. The last Republican elected there was elected with 74% of the vote, so the fact that we edged out a pretty clean win there is remarkable. I think it does suggest that the pendulum is swinging back, and that's obviously good news for us. However, even if the next election goes well, we're still going to face a number of very fundamental problems. The world is not going to change that dramatically, even if the Democrats take back the House, which is something I am praying for. We're still going to have the biggest gap in wealth and income that we've had since 1929, as Congressman Moran mentioned. Top 10% owning 2/3 of America's wealth. The top 1% owning fully 34% of America's wealth. The bottom 90% owning only 26% of America's wealth. Meanwhile, CEO pay has bounced back 29% over last year. The average CEO now earns $9 million a year. So what's caused this big wage gap and the riches enjoyed by corporate CEOs? Well, we've seen about 30 years of wage stagnation. Barack Obama used to talk about wages flatlining during the first decade of this century under George Bush. What's caused that? Well, globalization, trade deals that have sent jobs overseas, something particularly important for the AFL-CIO, the lack of bargaining power, something that is now under attack in Wisconsin and Indiana and Michigan. In fact, they have bills that are going to attempt to make it impossible for unions, if they can't take away collective bargaining, will make it impossible for unions to collect dues. In some cases, make it illegal for unions to collect dues to starve us, put us out of business. Right now, about 7% of the private sector belongs to unions. That's the lowest since before the Wagner Act. Before the labor laws that we live under now in 1935, we're back to that era of union density. It's the lowest in this hemisphere other than Colombia, South America, where it's still dangerous to be a union organizer. Last year, 55 union activists were murdered in Colombia, South America. This year, already a half dozen. We hope that'll change. And then, amazingly, we actually have very low taxes today, particularly for the wealthy. You would never know it listening to Eric Cantor and John Boehner. Taxes, as a percent of GDP, are now have not been lower than they are now since 1950. So we're collecting about the same percentage of taxes that we collected in 1950 before Medicare, Medicaid, and the highway system, and Homeland Security, and everything. So this brings us to the topic of money in politics. There's no doubt a strong correlation. We'll talk about that further today. That's certainly a good explanation for, or a further explanation for many of the problems we face. In 2010, the top 4 outside expenditures for politics, about $100 million, came from the Chamber of Commerce, American Crossroads, American Action Network, all right-wing organizations funded in part by the Koch brothers and people like that. The next 3 were labor unions, candidly, about $38 million. So the top 4 raised and spent $100 million, right-wing causes. The next 3 were unions, about $38 million. The next 6 account for another $60 million, so that's on top of the $100 million. Came from groups like the NRA, phony grass tops groups like 60 Plus, Club for Growth, Americans for Prosperity. Now, overall outside spending was about $190 million from conservative groups, about 90 from liberal groups, so a little bit less than half. Obviously, Citizens United led to that explosion in spending. In 2010, as Congressman Moran mentioned, about $300 million was spent outside the parties. In 2006, the last midterm, about $68 million was spent, so we saw about a five-fold increase. And before that, the midterm before that, 2002, only $26 million was spent. So we really have seen an explosion in spending, and most of it from the right wing, and that's why we have, I think, many of the problems that I cited earlier. I'm particularly interested in lobbying expenditures. I represent the AFL-CIO on Capitol Hill, and you might be interested to know that the Chamber of Commerce in 2010 spent $132 million lobbying in Washington. The AFL-CIO spent about $4 million. The money that we spend at the AFL-CIO actually equals the lobbying expenditure by the Vegetable, Fruit, and Tree Nut Association. they spend about $4 million as well. Overall, labor spent about $47 million. That's the AFL and all of our affiliates. The energy industry alone spent $450 million lobbying. So 47 by labor, 450 by energy alone. Finance and real estate spent about $475 million. So about 10 times, just one sector of the economy. Now, we have to be honest with ourselves. Democrats have to rely on business for money, just like Republicans do. Their share of campaign resources they get from organized labor is about 7%. The rest is from business. And it's actually remarkable that Democrats remain in Maine a progressive party, and a party that doesn't look out for working families. I don't want to say that particularly in the presence of Jim Moran. I know how hard it is to raise money, especially when you're up against the kind of odds that we face these days with the flood of right-wing money, and yet even with that, we have a lot of strong supporters in Congress, led by people like Jim Moran, who consistently look out for the interests of working families and working people. I'll end with this. I don't want to oversimplify the role of money in politics. As I said, Democrats take business money too, and many of them continue to support working families and worker issues. Again, New York 26, I mentioned at the beginning, conservative groups outspend liberal groups supporting the Democrat by much more than 2 to 1, so money doesn't always elect candidates by itself. As I said, the Democratic majority in Congress still is overwhelmingly liberal. It's not a majority, unfortunately, in the House anymore. Public financing would help. The AFL-CIO strongly supports public financing. At least it would even the playing field for candidates. Although I would say the thing that would help most would be stronger unions. As it was said in the introduction, for 100 years unions have been a bulwark against corporate, unfettered corporate power. In the 1940s, when unions represented a third of the workforce, productivity and profits and wages basically went together in a line and went up that way for about 25, 30 years. They tracked each other. When bargaining power began to fall off, when union density began to fall off, profits and productivity continued to rise. They're rising today. I mentioned CEO pay is exploding, and so are profits. Wages have flatlined since the 1970s, and corporations began their assault against unions, basically deregulated the world for workers who want to try to organize. So we think one of the primary goals for a new Democratic majority, which we hope to see in Congress in 2012, will be to strengthen unions. So we have our work cut out for us, but seeing you in this room gives me hope that we're headed in the right direction. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you.